A map hand-inked on aging paper. The lines are careful, coastlines of islands you recognize, and between them, a ghostly outline of something that no longer exists, or perhaps never did. Somewhere beneath those brushstrokes, a sentence from a scientific journal, written in 1864, waits to become something far larger than its author ever imagined. Out past the salt-scraped beaches of Mauritius and Madagascar, the Indian Ocean keeps its silence. But the questions those islands prompted, quiet, methodical questions about animals and distances, refuse to stay quiet for long.
Welcome to Unexplained History. I'm Tom McKenzie, and today we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most traveled ideas in modern myth. A word that began in a footnote and ended up reshaping how generations of people thought about where we came from. If you want to go even deeper after this episode, we have a full audiobook companion that takes you through the source documents, the debates, and the strange cultural afterlife of ideas like this one. Link is in the description. For now, let's start at the very beginning. It starts, as so many consequential things do, with someone simply trying to do their job well. A naturalist, a problem, and an ink pen moving across a page in Victorian London.
By the mid-19th century, European naturalists had built an extraordinary, if improvised, system of knowledge sharing. Bones and pressed skins crossed oceans in wooden crates. Sketches arrived folded inside letters that had been weeks at sea. Colonial specimen labels carried place names from shores that most recipients would never visit. The great natural history museums of Europe were, in effect, warehouses of global puzzlement, places where strange distributions of animals raised stubborn questions that no one had yet answered. Into this world came Philip Sclater, a zoologist whose eye for pattern and distribution was, by the standards of his day, exceptionally precise. In 1864, Philip published a paper in which he noted something that had been quietly troubling the field. Lemurs, those wide-eyed otherworldly primates, appeared in fossil records and living populations across both Madagascar and India, two places separated by a vast stretch of open ocean. The standard explanations of the time did not comfortably account for how a creature could exist, or have existed, in two such distant locations without some former connection between them. Philip's solution was measured, even modest. He proposed, as a working hypothesis, the existence of a former landmass, a bridge of land, now submerged, that might once have connected those regions. He called it Lemuria, naming it plainly after the animals whose distribution had prompted the question. It appeared on a map as a caption, a technical annotation, not a declaration. The tone in his writing was one of cautious reasoning, methodical, curious, careful not to overstate. He was filling a gap in the data, not writing a legend. And yet, the name stuck, the map circulated, and the word Lemuria, born inside a technical journal, began its long journey away from the question it was meant to answer. There is something particular about the moment when a cautious scientific phrase escapes its original context. Philip could not have watched the letters he exchanged, the specimens he catalogued, and the map caption he authorized become nodes in a far wider story, one that would, within decades, attach ideas of lost civilizations and human origins to the technical outline he had drawn. His paper continued to be cited, yes, but in ways that drifted steadily further from the biogeographic problem he had set out to solve. Collectors and curators used his framing as a point of departure, a respectable-sounding anchor for narratives that the original text had never gestured toward. Some later writers claimed that Lemuria, or a sunken landmass like it, had once been home to advanced human populations, a civilization-bearing continent that transmitted culture across the ancient world before sinking beneath the waves. These claims circulated widely, blending into spiritual movements, popular literature, and eventually into corners of the internet where they persist today. None of that was in the 1864 note. None of it was in the map caption. But the gap between what a word means and what people hear in it can be very wide indeed. That distance between a small scientific guess and the story it eventually fed is not trivial. A provisional hypothesis about lemur populations was remade over generations into a story that touched how people imagined human origins, migration, and cultural inheritance. The consequences of that transformation are real, and they are still worth examining. It began with ink on a silted map, with lemur eyes reflecting torchlight in a museum drawer, with salt air and specimen labels, and a naturalist trying to answer a reasonable question.
There's something that stays with me about Philip's situation. The way a careful person can put a careful idea into the world and have almost no control over where it goes next. I find that genuinely unsettling in a quiet way. Which is exactly what we're here to trace. Because the real question, the one that runs underneath all of this, is: how did a technical 1860s biogeographic supposition become a seed for myth-making across science, spirituality, and pulp fiction? We talked last time about how a single naturalist's note, a careful, modest observation about lemur distribution, opened a door that many other thinkers were ready to walk through. The question was never really about lemurs. It was about how living things ended up where they did, separated by vast stretches of ocean with no obvious explanation. What happens next is worth paying close attention to, because it shows how a working hypothesis in biology can slowly change shape and purpose as it passes from hand to hand through a scientific community.
Picture a large folio plate printed on heavy paper, its ink still holding the deep black of a careful engraver's hand. Lines arc across an unnamed ocean. Shaded regions mark hypothetical landmasses. A caption in small italic type names a territory that no expedition has ever charted and no sailor has ever logged. This is a Haeckel map, and to read one today is to sit with a curious object, rigorous in its visual grammar, bold beyond the evidence it could actually claim. Ernst Haeckel was one of the most widely read scientific popularizers of the late 19th century. His monographs reached audiences far beyond university lecture halls, translated, reprinted, and absorbed into the broader culture of natural history enthusiasm that characterized the era. Where Sclater had written a careful paper on animal geography, Ernst took the same underlying problem and gave it an ambitious new frame. He was not content to explain where lemurs lived. He wanted to explain where humanity itself had begun. The intellectual atmosphere rewarded this kind of reach. In a period before continental drift offered a mechanism for how land masses move, naturalists routinely proposed temporary land connections to explain species distributions. These were not reckless ideas, they were working tools, accepted within the methodological standards of the time. A sunken land bridge was an admissible inference, a way of filling explanatory gaps that the fossil record had not yet closed. Ernst understood this convention. He also understood how to use visual argument. His maps did something that prose alone could not. They made the speculative landmass feel concrete. Readers could see it, a broad shape in the Indian Ocean, labeled with a name borrowed from the earlier zoological conversation, now carrying a new and weightier suggestion. This, Haeckel proposed, might be where the earliest humans had lived and diversified, before spreading outward across a world still taking its present form. That move, from animal distribution to human origin, was a significant one. The zoological question had been modest. How do we account for related species on opposite sides of an ocean? The anthropological question was far more charged. Where did we come from? Ernst brought to that charged question the same intellectual fervor that drove his broader evolutionary writing. The confidence is visible in the captions, in the sweep of the shaded regions, in the willingness to name and locate something that remained entirely hypothetical. His published atlases, circulated alongside late 19th century monographs and naturalist correspondence, helped shape how educated readers visualized human prehistory. A reader who encountered one of his diagrams in a parlor setting, leafing through a journal by gaslight perhaps, while a debate about fossil evidence continued across the room, would carry away an image. The image was not labeled speculative. It looked like a finding. This is the gap worth marking carefully. Ernst was working within the standards of his discipline as he understood them. He was not fabricating data or acting in bad faith. But the creative confidence with which he extended biological inference into anthropological narrative, treating the logic of species distribution as sufficient grounds for locating the human cradle, meant that his speculative reach set a precedent. Once a map existed, once a name was attached to a shaded region and placed in a widely read volume, that name and that region had a life beyond the careful qualifications of any individual scholar. Later writers, some working in earnest, some working with quite different intentions, would return to those maps. They would cite the name, the location, the visual authority of the printed plate. What Ernst had offered as a reasoned inference, others would receive as something closer to a confirmed place. The distance between those two readings is where the history of this idea becomes genuinely complicated. Some would eventually claim that this territory had hosted not merely early humans but advanced civilization, a claim the original scientific framework had never supported and could not support.
What strikes me every time I look at one of those maps is how much authority the visual format carries on its own. The shading, the scale bars, the careful lettering, all of it signals scientific seriousness, even when the underlying claim is still an open question. That gap between appearance and evidence is exactly what makes this story worth following. Which brings us to the question that runs underneath all of this. What happens when a biological distribution hypothesis becomes a template for telling human origin stories? By the late 19th century, the word Lemuria had already done significant work in the world of natural science. But words, once loosed, have a way of traveling far beyond the rooms where they were coined. This one was about to cross a threshold from the catalogues of zoologists into something altogether different. What happens when a geological hypothesis gets handed to someone who sees the universe as layered with hidden meaning? You get doctrine, you get cosmology, and you get a name that suddenly carries the weight of human destiny.
Picture a reading room, late in the evening. The lamp throws warm light across a crowded desk. Maps, annotated, folded, softened at the edges, lie beneath an open volume. A hand turns a page, and a voice begins to read. The prose is dense, commanding, utterly certain of itself. This is the secret doctrine. In 1888, Helena Blavatsky published that work, 2 vast volumes that propose nothing less than a complete history of the cosmos, humanity, and time itself. Within its pages, Lemuria was no longer a biogeographical convenience, invented to explain where lemurs lived. It had become the home of what Blavatsky called an early root race, a stage of human development so remote it preceded recorded memory entirely. The rhetorical move was audacious. She borrowed a term from comparative zoology, stripped it of its scientific modesty, and dressed it in the language of esoteric revelation. Where Haeckel had hedged, Blavatsky declared. Where scientists spoke of probability, she spoke of epochs, measured in millions of years, of continental masses rising and sinking according to laws that only initiates could fully comprehend. The salons and drawing rooms where theosophy circulated were lit by the same oil lamps that illuminated Darwin on nearby shelves. The people who attended these gatherings were not, by and large, credulous in any simple sense. They read widely. They debated. But they also attended seances and believed that the material world was a surface beneath which far older truths waited. Helena moved through these spaces with unmistakable authority, her delivery performative, her certainty absolute, her ambition transformative. Some who encountered her writings claimed they found for the first time a framework that made sense of everything: evolution, spiritual progress, the rise and fall of peoples, the hidden hand behind history. That framework required an ancient homeland, a vast, now vanished continent that had allegedly hosted early humanity and passed something essential forward across the ages. The claim, circulating through theosophical circles, was that this place had been a civilization-bearing land, whose submergence explained gaps in every tradition simultaneously. It is important to pause here. The epical vocabulary Blavatsky developed, root races succeeding one another across geological time, carried racialized assumptions that were dangerous then and remain so now. The language of ranked human stages dressed in spiritual authority would be borrowed by others whose intentions were far darker. That inheritance matters. It is part of what the history of this idea requires us to reckon with. Yet the immediate consequence of the secret doctrine, for the communities that embraced it, was something more like revelation than warning. Helena's readers did not treat her prose as speculation. They treated it as canon. Study groups formed around her chapters. Correspondence networks spread her terminology across continents. A word that had lived in footnotes of natural history journals now appeared in letters exchanged between seekers in London, New York, and Madras. And something else followed, something that would echo far beyond her own lifetime. Readers began to look. If a drowned continent had shaped the ancient world, then perhaps its traces could still be found, in temple alignments, in folk memory, in geological formations that had never been satisfactorily explained. Helena had handed her audience not just a belief but a project. The metaphysical map invited exploration.
That is what makes this moment so significant. A scientific hypothesis, already speculative, passed through Blavatsky's hands and came out the other side as something communities would organize around, argue over, and go looking for. The secret doctrine gave Lemuria a mythology, and myths, as we know, are remarkably hard to put back in the box. Which brings us to the question at the heart of what we've just heard. Why did theosophy take a geological hypothesis and give it metaphysical authority? There's a particular kind of book that doesn't just tell you something. It convinces you that you were always supposed to know it. The kind with dramatic maps folded inside the cover, plates of carved symbols, and a narrator who writes like he's letting you in on the secret of the century. In the 1920s, one man had exactly that gift. His name was James Churchward, and by the time his books hit the shelves, the popular imagination was already primed. The question is, what did he actually offer readers, and how did he make it all feel so real?
Picture the pulp rack of a 1920s newsstand. Vivid covers crowded with promise, sunken temples, crumbling colossi, civilization swallowed whole by an indifferent sea. This was the visual grammar of the era, and James Churchward understood it instinctively. He did not write like an academic hedging claims. He wrote like an explorer who had already been there. His 1926 work, later reissued in 1931 as The Lost Continent of Mu, presented a sweeping argument that an enormous civilization had once flourished in the Pacific, a supercontinent he called Mu, cradle of humanity itself, eventually swallowed beneath the waves. The evidence he offered was not geological survey or peer-reviewed archaeology. It was something far more theatrical. Churchward claimed he had gained access years earlier, in circumstances left artfully vague, to a set of ancient clay tablets. He called them the Nakal tablets, and he asserted that a learned priest had helped him decode their symbols, revealing the full history of the lost Pacific homeland. Some have since claimed these tablets represent authentic primary evidence for Mu. Scholars, however, have found no independently verifiable account of their existence, no institution that holds them, no trail that leads anywhere solid. What Churchward offered instead of provenance was atmosphere, and he offered it in abundance. His books were packed with illustrations. Pacific maps marked with the outline of the drowned continent. Plates comparing carved symbols from Easter Island, Mexico, India, and Egypt, all arranged to suggest a single vanished source. Readers could look at those images and feel the argument without needing to interrogate it. That was deliberate, and it was brilliant. The enthusiasm in his prose was infectious. James wrote with the certainty of a man who had personally walked the ruins, personally translated the inscriptions, personally reconstructed a world that scholarship had failed to notice. That apparent certainty, confident, unhurried, delivered in the tone of someone simply setting the record straight, made skepticism feel almost rude. He wasn't speculating. He was remembering on behalf of a civilization that could no longer speak for itself. He did not stop at one book. James published repeatedly, each volume expanding the claims, weaving in new comparative imagery, new anecdotes from unnamed sources, new plates of carvings from wind-battered Polynesian stone platforms, and the brooding profiles of Easter Island moai. Each book reinforced the last, and together they created something that looked, from the outside, like a body of research, a literature with internal consistency, cross-references, and the weight of accumulated assertion. That literature did not exist in isolation. The pulp era was hungry for exactly this kind of material, exotic, visual, just plausible enough to feel like recovered fact rather than invention. Travelogue aesthetics gave his pages the texture of adventure journalism. Map plates gave readers something to hold and study. By the time a reader finished one of his books, the Pacific had been reimagined, populated, organized, civilized, and then erased by geological catastrophe. It was a complete world, rendered with showman's confidence. The consequence of that confidence was lasting. When popular books recast speculation as recovered history, they create narratives that persist long after scholarship has moved on. James Churchward's maps and symbol comparisons became visual templates that later writers borrowed, built upon, and passed forward, often without returning to ask whether the original source could be verified at all. The unverifiable provenance of his claimed tablets was not a flaw his readers worried over. It was a detail the storytelling buried beneath momentum.
There's something worth sitting with there. The books kept coming, the maps kept circulating, and each new edition added another layer of apparent authority. Whether James believed every word he wrote, or whether he was a skilled entertainer who understood his audience, or some complicated mixture of both, the effect was the same. Mu entered the popular imagination with the force of remembered fact. Which brings us to the real puzzle at the center of all this. What did Churchward offer readers that made Mu feel both plausible and sensational, despite the absence of verifiable provenance. Before theories travel, people carry them. And the people who carried Lemuria and Mu were a remarkably varied group: a zoologist, a biologist, a mystic, and a showman, each with a distinct way of making the unverifiable feel inevitable. What I find worth sitting with is how different their methods were, and yet how the idea passed between them almost seamlessly. That's what we're going to look at closely in this segment.
Imagine a lamplit library late in the 19th century. Specimen labels arranged in neat columns, a magnifying lens resting on a leather blotter, and somewhere in that quiet, a man trying to solve a distribution problem that the maps of his time could not answer. Philip Sclater was working from evidence, real zoological evidence, when he noticed that lemur fossils appeared on land masses separated by an ocean that should have kept them apart. His solution was speculative but not irrational for its moment: a land bridge, or perhaps a vanished continent, connecting what is now Madagascar to parts of Asia. He called it Lemuria, almost as a convenience, a working label for a geographical hypothesis. That caution, scientific, provisional, hedged, was the first keynote. Ernst Haeckel struck a different one. Where Sclater catalogued, Haeckel extrapolated. His pen moved across maps with the confidence of a man who believed evolution, if followed far enough back, would require a cradle somewhere now submerged. Lemuria became, in his sketches and lectures, not merely a zoological convenience, but a chapter in human prehistory. The leap was enormous. The authority he brought to it, as a prominent naturalist speaking at the height of evolutionary theory's public excitement, made the leap feel like a reasoned step. Authority travels differently depending on who holds it. Helena Blavatsky did not pretend to work from fossils or field surveys. She worked from revelation, or what she presented as revelation, and in the dusty theosophical salons where her followers gathered, that distinction mattered less than the texture of certainty she projected. Her lectures and writings transformed Lemuria into a cosmic narrative, a stage on which ancient root races played out spiritual dramas across geological time. The imagery was vivid, the system elaborate, and for her audiences, the absence of physical proof was not a weakness. It was almost the point. Mystery, for Blavatsky, was a credential. James Churchward came later and louder. In turn of the century spiritualist parlors and the pages of popular books, he insisted he had personally handled ancient tablets. Clay records, he claimed, that described the continent of Mu in precise detail. The showmanship was deliberate. Churchward's annotations on his own maps, his habit of citing sources that could not be easily traced or verified, created a performance of scholarship that felt authoritative to readers who lacked the tools or the inclination to test it. He was not building a hypothesis, he was building an experience. What each of these figures understood, perhaps instinctively, was that an idea needs a narrator as much as it needs evidence. Sclater's caution gave the concept scientific respectability at its origin. Haeckel's ambition scaled it to human prehistory. Blavatsky's certainty gave it metaphysical weight. Churchward's bravado made it accessible entertainment. Together, never in collaboration, often in ignorance of one another's precise claims, they built a layered architecture of authority that the idea would inhabit for more than a century. There is a particular irony in where geology eventually arrived. By the 1960s, the broad scientific community had accepted the theory of plate tectonics, the understanding that continents move on slow-shifting plates, that land masses once joined have drifted apart over vast timescales. Trond H. Torsvik, a geoscientist whose work would later contribute to this field's precision, has noted that the movement of tectonic plates fully accounts for why species like lemurs appear on now separated landmasses. There is no need to invoke a recently sunken continent. The ocean floors themselves preserve the record, and that record does not include a large landmass swallowed whole within human prehistory. Trond's approach reflects something worth paying attention to, a steady analytic resolve that resists the pull of dramatic narrative when the data points elsewhere. He has engaged with public interpretation of Earth history, publishing technical work that becomes a touchstone for those who follow, clarifying where the science actually stands. That kind of patient engagement is its own form of authority, quieter than Churchward's showmanship, less theatrical than Blavatsky's certainties, but durable in a way that the others were not. Some voices online still circulate the claim that findings related to so-called Mauritia constitute scientific proof of a lost continent matching Lemuria. The researchers involved in that work have been clear that what they identified were ancient fragments of continental crust, old material carried beneath the ocean floor by tectonic processes, not evidence of a large, recently inhabited landmass. The gap between what the data shows and what the narrative requires remains wide. But as the figures in this segment demonstrated so effectively, that gap has rarely stopped a good story. The hands tell you something. Sclater's hands sorting specimen labels, Haeckel's pen moving across a blank map, Blavatsky's notes accumulating in the margins of her own lectures, Churchward's annotations building a paper architecture that looked at a distance like archaeology. Each set of hands was doing different work, but each was shaping what an audience would feel when they encountered the word Lemuria or Mu for the first time.
The science, when it came, was thorough. Plate tectonics gave us a mechanism that explains species distribution across separated continents. No sunken landmass required. And yet, the cultural weight of these ideas outlasted the scientific case against them by decades. That gap is what I keep returning to. How do personal style and public credibility allow speculative ideas to accumulate cultural weight beyond their empirical support? When science steps in, the conversation changes. Storytelling runs on resonance. Geology runs on measurement. And what the instruments have found beneath the Indian Ocean is genuinely remarkable, even before anyone adds a single myth to it. But here's the thing about remarkable findings. They attract interpretation. Sometimes careful interpretation, sometimes not. So let's start with what the data actually says.
A zircon grain is almost impossibly small, a fraction of a millimeter, and yet it carries within its crystal lattice a record of time that stretches back billions of years. Under the right instruments, geologists can read that record. Uranium decays to lead at a known rate. The ratio tells you when the crystal formed. It is, in its way, one of the most reliable clocks in natural science. In 2013, a research team led by Trond H. Torsvik published findings in Nature Geoscience that drew on exactly this kind of geochronological work. Their analysis identified fragments of ancient Precambrian continental crust, material dating back more than 1 billion years, buried beneath parts of the Indian Ocean floor near Mauritius. They named this buried fragment Mauritia. The evidence came from multiple directions. Zircon grains recovered from beach sands, carried up through volcanic activity from the deep crust, showed ages wildly inconsistent with the unoceanic basalt surrounding them. Seismic imaging added another layer. Gravitational and magnetic anomalies beneath the seafloor hinted at thicker, older crust in places where ocean floor alone should sit. Together, these lines of evidence pointed to a microcontinent, a sliver of ancient landmass that had been stretched, thin, rifted apart, and eventually submerged as the Indian Ocean opened over hundreds of millions of years. Trond and his colleagues were careful about what this meant. The excitement from a geological standpoint was real. Discovering remnant Precambrian crust beneath young ocean floor refines our understanding of how supercontinents like Gondwana fragmented and dispersed. It fills gaps in plate reconstruction models. It is the kind of finding that earns a place in the literature, precisely because it is well supported and falsifiable. What it does not do, what the data cannot do, is compress a billion years of geological history into a human timescale. Mauritia was not submerged during any period that overlaps with anatomically modern human beings. The rifting and drowning of this microcontinent played out across deep time, long before any ancestral hominid existed anywhere on Earth. The Precambrian era ended roughly 541 million years ago. The gap between Mauritia's submersion and the earliest human presence is not a historical mystery. It is a chasm measured in hundreds of millions of years. Nevertheless, the paper's publication generated popular attention that its authors had not sought and could not entirely control. In online forums, in documentary treatments, and in popular articles, the word Mauritia began appearing alongside a much older word, Lemuria. The claim circulating in those spaces was direct, that this peer-reviewed geology had confirmed the existence of a lost civilization, a sunken landmass where an advanced human culture once flourished. Trond found himself in a position familiar to researchers whose technical work crosses into public consciousness. The analytic satisfaction of the discovery, years of careful measurement, peer review, the discipline of the scientific record, sat alongside a growing frustration as that work was stripped of its temporal context and reframed to support claims the data simply did not make. He engaged in public explanation where he could, working to restore the stratigraphic timeline that popular accounts had quietly discarded. That corrective effort, returning to the measurements, restating what the zircons and the seismic profiles and the plate models actually show, is itself a kind of scientific behavior worth noting. It reflects a commitment not just to the original finding, but to the integrity of how findings are used. Continued publication, continued refinement, these are how the record gets clearer, even when the public conversation around it does not. The instruments are precise. The satellite swaths of Indian Ocean blue, the seismic waveform playback, the isotope ratios glowing on a lab monitor, they all point in the same direction. Mauritia is real. It is ancient beyond meaningful human reckoning. And that distinction between a Precambrian crustal fragment and a lost human civilization is not a minor technical caveat. It is the entire question.
So, the science here isn't actually contested, not among geologists. A fragment of old crust, buried beneath young ocean floor, identified through rigorous geochronology. That's the finding. Where things get complicated is in the journey from that finding to the claims that followed it. Which brings us to the question that sits at the center of all of this. What does a microcontinental fragment tell us? And crucially, what does it not tell us about human history? There's a moment in one recording, a woman describing the first time she walked into a theosophical reading group, where she pauses, and you can hear her searching for the right word. She settles on recognized, not learned, recognized, like something she already carried had finally been named. That feeling keeps showing up across testimonies, across decades, across very different communities. And it raises a real question. What is it that Lemuria is actually doing for the people who hold it close?
The lamplit reading rooms of late 19th century theosophy were full of people looking for exactly that feeling. Not laboratory proof, not geological verification. Something closer to coherence, a story large enough to explain why the modern world felt so fractured, and old enough to promise that something better had once existed. Helena Blavatsky gave that story a grammar. In her voluminous writings, she described Lemuria as one of several root races, a now sunken continent that had housed an earlier phase of human spiritual development. The geological underpinning was already fraying by the time she wrote, but that mattered less than what the idea could carry. An origin that was both ancient and recoverable, a past that made the present feel purposeful. Helena never claimed to be a scientist. Her authority, such as it was, rested on a different kind of credibility: visionary access, esoteric tradition, the sense that certain knowledge had been preserved outside academic channels. And for readers exhausted by the cold arithmetic of industrial modernity, that alternative credibility was genuinely appealing. It felt like a door left open in a wall everyone else insisted was solid. The communities that formed around her texts did something that pure intellectual interest rarely does. They created belonging. Shared reading, shared vocabulary, shared ritual, the kind of social infrastructure that turns an idea into an identity. Theosophical lodges in dusty salon spaces, their walls lined with maps and borrowed cosmologies, became places where people who felt out of step with mainstream culture could find a congregation. When James Churchward arrived in the early 20th century with his claims about the Narkal tablets, ancient records, he said, documented the civilization of Mu, he was stepping into a readership already primed. Some adherents still hold that those tablets represent authentic primary evidence for a vanished continent, though no independent scholar has been able to examine or verify them. But the evidentiary question for many in these communities arrives second. The emotional question arrives first. Part of what made the Lemuria myth so durable was that it arrived wearing the clothes of science. It had emerged, originally, from a naturalist's attempt to explain a fossil distribution puzzle. It had maps. It had terminology. That veneer of scientific legitimacy, even after the underlying geology moved on, gave believers a way to hold the idea with a kind of confidence. It didn't sound like pure invention. It sounded like a discovery that the establishment had simply failed to follow up on. In New Age contexts that came later, Helena's metaphors traveled far from their original framing. Lemurian imagery found its way into healing practices, into workshop settings, into personal narratives of recovery and reconnection. Followers integrated the symbolism into their own ritual lives. Some spoke of pilgrimage-like journeys to sites they associated with the lost continent. Others built online communities that sustained and elaborated the tradition, across geography and generation. The yearning that Helena had tapped was not diminishing. It was finding new vessels. What the scholars who study these movements tend to note is that the myth's persistence has very little to do with the fossil record, and a great deal to do with what it offers emotionally. It fills gaps, not just the explanatory gaps that missing fossils or puzzling cultural parallels once seemed to create, but existential ones. Questions about origin, about lost harmony, about whether the present moment is a fall from something better. Lemuria, in this sense, functions as a kind of comfort, not a scientific claim so much as a symbolic resource for people navigating grief, dislocation, or the search for purpose.
And it's worth sitting with that for a moment, because it reframes what we're actually looking at. These testimonies, the theosophical readers, the workshop participants, the archival voices that have been collected over more than a century, they're not primarily making a geological argument. They're describing something that works for them in a very different register. The question of whether Lemuria existed and the question of what Lemuria does for people who believe in it are not quite the same question. Which brings us to the harder conversation ahead. Because if the evidence is weak, What emotional or social needs does Lemuria satisfy for its adherents? We've spent time with the people who believe in Mu, who feel it in their bones, who find meaning in the idea of a lost world beneath the waves. That matters. But belief, however sincere, isn't the same as history. So let's talk about what history actually requires. The question isn't whether a lost civilization would be extraordinary. Of course it would. The question is, what kind of evidence would we need to move it from story to fact? Archaeology has an answer. Geology has an answer. Epigraphy has an answer. And those answers are specific.
Imagine the control room of a mid-century oceanographic vessel, paper charts unrolling across a steel table, sonar pings echoing up through the hull, geologists hunched over sediment cores pulled from thousands of feet below the surface. This is where the test begins. Not in a library, not in a dream, on the seafloor itself, in isotope labs and seismic profiles, in the slow, unglamorous work of reading rock. Archaeology's first demand is stratigraphic context. When an object is found, its layer matters as much as the object itself. Depth, surrounding material, associated artifacts. These are the coordinates that place a find in time. Remove an object from that context, and you lose the very information that would make it meaningful. A tablet without a documented excavation site is, scientifically speaking, a tablet without a past. The second demand is datable material. Modern methods allow researchers to establish the age of organic material, sediment layers, and mineral formations with considerable precision. A claim about a civilization existing tens of thousands of years ago in a specific geographic region must account for the rock record of that region. And that record speaks in the language of plate tectonics and deep time, not human lifetimes. The third demand is independent replication, a translation that only one person can perform, using a system only that person devised, is not a translation in any scholarly sense. Epigraphy. The study of inscriptions requires that a decipherment be testable, that others, working independently with the same source material, arrive at comparable results. Without that, what looks like a reading is more accurately described as an interpretation with no external check. Martin Gardner, the writer and critic who spent decades examining popular claims about archaeology in the ancient world, understood something important about how these standards get quietly discarded. With a dry, careful wit, wry clarity was almost a signature of his prose. Gardner noted that sensational claims tend to substitute the emotional force of an idea for the evidentiary weight it actually carries. The story feels true, and that feeling does a lot of work that evidence is supposed to do. Consider what the Churchward tradition actually rests on. Some claim that a lost continent called Mu, or Lemuria, was a recently sunken civilization-bearing landmass that hosted advanced humans and transmitted culture across the globe. But when researchers ask for the chain of custody behind the tablets Churchward described, the documentation of where they were found, who handled them, how they were authenticated, the trail goes cold. The tablets themselves have never been produced for independent examination. The glyphs Churchward compared across cultures were selected and arranged by Churchward alone, using a method he devised, and that no independent epigraphic body has validated. This is precisely the pattern Martin described as characteristic of pseudo-scientific claims: selective reading of symbols, questionable accounts of source materials, and the conflation of superficially similar features from unrelated cultures. Gardner's work encouraged lay readers, ordinary people curious about the past, to ask harder questions, not to dismiss wonder, but to demand that extraordinary claims earn their place at the table through ordinary verification. And the geological record adds its own weight. Seafloor mapping, seismic profiles, and plate reconstruction studies have built a detailed picture of how ocean basins form and evolve over millions of years. There is no empirical evidence in that record for a recently sunken continent capable of supporting a large, organized civilization within any time frame relevant to human history. Geological features that proponents sometimes cite, underwater ridges, submerged plateaus, are accounted for by well-established mechanisms that predate human existence by orders of magnitude. The rock does not lie, and it does not leave room for mew. What's at stake in getting this right extends beyond academic tidiness. Rigorous standards protect both the historical record and living communities from misattribution and erasure. When a civilization's achievements are reassigned to a mythic source, the actual people who built those things, their descendants, their cultures, are quietly written out. Demanding provenance isn't pedantry. It's a form of respect.
Stratigraphy, datable material, independent replication. These aren't arbitrary hurdles. They're the tools that separate what we can actually know from what we wish were true. And applying them isn't an act of cynicism. It's an act of care. Which brings us to the harder version of the question we've been circling all along. What standards of evidence would convert myth into verified history? And do any claimed artifacts meet them? There's a moment in any investigation where you stop asking what happened and start asking what it cost. The stories around Lemuria and Mu didn't fade when the science moved on. They traveled, changed hands, and landed somewhere more complicated. This is the part of the history that deserves the most careful attention, because the consequences are real, and they're still unfolding.
Imagine standing on a salt-scraped beach near Mauritius, wind off the Indian Ocean. Somewhere behind you, a radio crackles, with a documentary claiming this coastline sits above the ruins of a lost civilization. A scholar's voice interrupts, careful, measured, warning that the geological feature being cited means nothing of the sort. Then, silence. The silence of a local elder who has watched this story arrive, reshape the landscape in other people's imaginations, and erase the communities who actually built their lives here. That silence carries weight. When myths about sunken continents hosting advanced, globe-spanning civilizations move into popular media, films, podcasts, online communities, they rarely arrive alone. They arrive carrying assumptions about who in the ancient world was capable of greatness and who was not. Those assumptions have a history, and that history runs through the work of Helena Blavatsky. Helena's theosophical writings introduced a framework she called root races, a sequence of civilizations she believed had populated the Earth across vast spiritual epochs. Lemuria featured prominently in that scheme. Scholars who have examined this framework closely have documented that it carried racialized and pseudo-scientific ideas woven into its core architecture. Those ideas were not incidental. They structured how certain populations were ranked, how their histories were interpreted, and how their proximity to ancient wisdom was measured, by criteria that owed more to 19th century racial thought than to any recoverable evidence. What scholars have traced, carefully and with documented evidence, is that this vocabulary did not stay inside theosophical circles. It moved. 20th century ideological movements found the framework useful. The language of lost root civilizations, of hierarchies encoded into human origins, of some peoples as remnants and others as inheritors. Helena's intentions may have been spiritual rather than political, but intent does not determine impact, and the framework she built was repurposed in ways that caused measurable harm to marginalized communities. Popular media amplified a parallel problem: the claim that Lemuria, or Mu, was a recently sunken civilization-bearing continent that transmitted culture globally circulated through films, novels, and eventually digital platforms. When the discovery of Mauritia, a genuine fragment of ancient continental crust buried beneath the Indian Ocean floor, became public, some communities seized on it as confirmation. Scientists were explicit. The finding described deep geological history, not the remains of human habitation. That clarification rarely traveled as far as the original headline. Narrative coherence won over scientific nuance, and local histories along the coasts of Mauritius and Madagascar were quietly repositioned as footnotes to a story those communities had no part in writing. Consider what gets displaced when that substitution happens. The stone platforms of Polynesia, wind-battered and carefully constructed across generations, represent engineering choices, spiritual traditions, and social organization that archaeologists and descendant communities have worked for decades to understand on their own terms. Framing those monuments as evidence of a lost mother civilization doesn't illuminate them, it empties them, replacing what is known with what is imagined, and in doing so, centering people who were never there while sidelining the people whose ancestors built and maintained those structures. The concern is not abstract. When myths replace documented histories, they can contribute to cultural erasure and justify narratives that harm real communities. That is not a hypothetical risk attached to old books. It is a pattern that historians, archaeologists, and indigenous scholars have documented across multiple continents and multiple decades. The response from researchers and curators has been to insist on contextualization, to present theosophical materials with clear framing about their historical origins and their documented consequences, rather than allowing the ideas to circulate without that critical scaffolding. Public conversations are changing too, slowly. There is growing recognition that origin myths carry power, that the stories a culture tells about who came first, who built what, and who deserves to inherit the past are never neutral. Helena's legacy sits uncomfortably at the center of that recognition, a thinker whose ambitions were vast, whose influence spread far, and whose framework left behind complications that historians and cultural stewards are still working to address with rigor and moral seriousness. That reckoning is ongoing.
So, we're left sitting with something uncomfortable. These aren't just old ideas that faded harmlessly into history. They moved through the 20th century, shaped how some people understood the world, and they're still moving through media, through online communities, through the quiet displacement of local knowledge by more dramatic narratives. And that brings us to the question we can't avoid. Who benefits when myth supplants local histories, and who is silenced by such substitutions? We've covered a lot of ground in this episode, from a Victorian naturalist's practical question about lemur fossils through layers of mythology, metaphysics, and modern geology. And now we're at the place every good inquiry eventually arrives: the inventory. What actually holds up, and what do we do with the rest? I want to take a few minutes to be honest about that, clearly, carefully, and I hope with some respect for why these stories matter to people in the first place.
Picture it like this: a grain of zircon under a microscope. Ancient, crystalline, indifferent to legend. It holds its own record, written in isotopes and pressure, a clock that ticks in millions of years. Somewhere beyond the lab window, the ocean moves. Pages turn. and the distance between what we feel and what we can verify quietly asserts itself. The geological record has been, throughout this story, the steadiest voice in the room. Plate, reconstructions, and radiometric dating place continental fragments, like Mauritia, in deep time. Ancient remnants predating any human presence by hundreds of millions of years. Those findings are not contested among researchers working in the relevant fields. They constrain firmly and specifically the more expansive claims. There is no geologically supported, recently submerged landmass that could have hosted a civilization and then vanished within human memory. That matters when we turn to the Churchward question. The claim that his so-called Nakal tablets constituted authentic primary evidence for a lost continent called Mu was central to how his work was received in popular culture. But scholars examining his methods found something quite different. Sources that could not be verified, reconstructions that far outran any available evidence, and interpretive leaps presented with the confidence of discovery. The tablets, as independent primary documents, simply do not hold up to scrutiny. Martin Gardner spent years examining claims like Churchward's, not with contempt, but with the calm, disciplined attention of someone who understood that bad reasoning causes real harm. Gardner's critiques of Mu and similar constructions labeled them plainly pseudo-science, in some cases barely distinguishable from hoax in terms of evidentiary quality. He said so with clarity, not cruelty, and that distinction matters. What Martin left behind was something more durable than any particular debunking. He modeled a habit of mind, asking where the source comes from, who verified it, what would count as evidence against it. Readers who encountered his work found themselves often gradually reaching for verifiable sources before sensational ones. That shift, quiet, personal, cumulative, is exactly the kind of behavior change that keeps public knowledge honest. And there is a civic dimension to this, one Gardner understood well. When a myth attaches itself to real communities, to peoples with actual histories, living traditions, and legitimate cultural memory, the stakes of getting the story wrong are not merely academic. Fabricated origin narratives can crowd out real ones. They can flatten complex histories into decorative backdrops for someone else's imagination. Holding a claim to evidence, in that context, is not pedantry. It is a form of respect. None of this means the longing behind these myths is invalid. Origin stories serve genuine needs, for belonging, for depth, for the sense that human life is embedded in something larger than the immediate present. Those needs are real, and they deserve real answers. The satellite image of an Indian Ocean stretching blue and vast, the silted margins of a Victorian map, the ink-stained journal of someone trying to make sense of the world, these speak to something authentic in us. The question is whether we honor that impulse by feeding it fantasy, or by pointing it toward the genuinely astonishing record that evidence actually provides. Scientific integrity and human dignity are not in competition. Holding stories to evidence preserves both. It protects the discipline that makes real discovery possible, and it protects the real human histories that myth, left unchecked, can sometimes quietly erase. That is what this entire reckoning ultimately points toward. The endnotes for this episode will direct you to primary sources and scholarly critiques, including the work of researchers whose careful analysis of geological and archaeological evidence forms the bedrock of what we've discussed. They will also point toward further reading on how scientific hypotheses sometimes migrate into legend, and what that journey reveals about us as much as about the ideas themselves.
Thank you for spending this time with us. The story of Mu is, in a way, the story of how an idea travels, from a footnote in a scientific paper, through seance rooms and pulp novels, into something that millions of people have found genuinely meaningful. Understanding that journey doesn't diminish the wonder. If anything, it makes the real history more interesting. And that's maybe the question I'll leave you with, the one I keep coming back to myself. How do we keep the wonder of origin stories while insisting on standards of evidence and respect for living communities.